He is regarded as the preeminent Russian scholar in the US academe. He has come to us today to give us perhaps to give us an alternative view to the one that we get from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, from people like we had. In fact, we invited on Paul Dibb, who wrote in The Australian this week as an apparent strategic expert that Vladimir Putin has a shopping list of spies that he's working through to liquidate. Stephen Cohen, welcome to Outsiders.
Well, I wish I really was with you, because it's extremely cold here and they say it's going to snow. And I guess it's different in Australia, but thanks for having me on.
Give us your headline reactions to the Skripal event.
Well, it's further evidence that the official story makes no sense whatsoever. I can't imagine what motive, and bear in mind, Ross, they say Putin personally directed this attack. I can't think of a single motive Putin would have, not at this moment in history and politics with the World Cup and all the rest. I guess Mr. Dibbs says Putin's working down a list of people to kill. There's no evidence of that. There's a lot of former spies from the Soviet Union and Russia living in London and Washington, going on TV. They're still alive. But even if Mr. Dibbs was right, why now? The timing doesn't make sense. So you got no motive. The lab in London says, or rather not London, but at Porton Down, says it can't identify the agent. That's a variation on the official story. It was said to be an exceedingly lethal nerve agent. If so, the Skripals, the father and the daughter, should be dead, not talking on the telephone. So should be the policeman who came to their rescue on the park bench. And it said that some 200 people in that park were affected. So far as we know, none are even in hospital. So there's something terribly wrong with this story. Now, whether it's a false flag, as you say, that somebody did this on purpose to disrupt East-West relations, or whether it was an operation that went very badly wrong, I don't know. But the official story certainly is not true.
Well, and my impulse to call it a false flag is not so much based on the evidence of the event, in which, as I read it, there is virtually not a single verifiable fact, but the evidence of the cover-up which has taken place afterwards, in which the UK, the British Foreign Office, indeed the CEO of Salisbury Hospital, the Metropolitan Police, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister are just trashing and traducing both European, international public law, all the conventions which Britain has signed up to in relation to access to the hospital, in relation to sharing of the substance with Russia. We understand that that the Chemical Weapons Prevention Convention requires England to share the substance with Russia. Why has that not taken place?
I can't tell you. You're absolutely right. There are very precise, not only guidelines, but obligations of what countries must do when there's an allegation of a chemical weapon being used. And the United Kingdom government has followed none of these obligations. Russia has asked, as is its right, repeatedly for a sample. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this comes at a very strange moment. I don't know whether you know this or not, but this summer, I don't remember whether June or July, the European Union will have to vote whether or not to continue sanctions on Russia. At least 4 or 5 EU countries do not want to continue. It takes only one country to vote no, and the European sanctions end. It appeared that might be the case, but no longer in the light of the Skripal affair. So there is a lot at stake. There's also the fragility of the May government in England. It didn't look like she was long for office. This seems to have, at least for a couple of weeks, rallied the country around her. But if the story falls apart, I assume she'll have to resign. And so who knows what will happen next in England. The point is, every point you made is valid. We have no evidence, but we have enormous and negative consequences in a situation that's already fraught with war with Russia. So this is a very, very bad thing.
Stephen, Australians are fed essentially an unvaried diet of a two-dimensional view of Putin as a former KGB guy, seeking to rebuild who was devastated emotionally by the collapse of the Soviet Union and who wishes to restore its former imperial glory by an aggressive program of sabre-rattling and invading other sovereign states. Tell us, MH17 certainly sticks in the mind of many Australians, where we lost 28 of our own citizens in the bringing down of that civilian aircraft. I'm going to ask you to answer two questions in succession. Firstly, what is your view? What is your answer to Australians who have a lingering hostility towards Russia in relation to MH17? And secondly, what is your view if Putin is not seeking to re-establish the Soviet Union? What is his vision and mission for Russia?
So to answer, I have to set out my credo, which is also the credo of medical doctors, whose first oath is do no harm. It should be the credo of every scholar, of every journalist, every policymaker, everyone. In order to make judgments or do analysis or reach conclusions, we need facts. Without facts, we're lost. We're lost in life, we're lost in politics, and it becomes exceedingly dangerous. Regarding the shoot-down of the Malaysian aircraft, it was an enormous tragedy. I have friends in the Netherlands who feel this terribly because so many Dutch people died on that plane. I understand the feeling in Australia. But here's the basic facts, such as they are. The investigation, which was run by the Dutch, but the Australians joined, over a period of about 2 years, came to only two conclusions. That the missile was fired was a Buk, B-U-K. There's agreement on that. And they know approximately where it was fired from. But that tells us nothing about who fired it. Ukraine was part of the Soviet, a central part, maybe the main part, of the Soviet military complex during the Soviet era. Many, many Soviet-era weapons were and remain in Ukraine today, including Buks. There are dozens of them. So to say that some truck had to ship a Buk to Ukraine, shoot down an airplane, and then like a thief in the night, creep back to the Soviet Union is not a fact. There are plenty of Buks there. The other fact we don't know is there was a civil war of fighting going on in that area between the rebel forces in Donbass and Ukrainian army units. We do not know which occupied that territory at the moment that the missile was fired. And the Dutch authorities have been unable to tell us. So the fact is, we do not know. Now, whether the investigation is going to continue, I don't know. But let me add one piece of information that may not be known in Australia. The United States, because this was a strategic area when the plane was shot down, had surveillance all over that area. They have tapes, they have radar, they have everything that would be needed to abet a real investigation. So far as I know, the United States government has still refused to turn that surveillance information over to the Dutch authorities. I do not know why. But until that's released, we're not going to get anything approaching a definitive answer as to who and why that plane was shot down. That's the end of the story so far as facts are concerned at this moment in the year 2018.
So Stephen, Paul Dibb, a so-called expert in Australia, was invited to come on the show. He declined. But But one of the facts, I guess the facts that I would point to would be a long line of people who appear to have crossed Putin or been a rival to Putin or criticised the Putin regime or in some way made themselves potential enemies of Putin, who have wound up either being poisoned, stabbed in the back, shot outside the Kremlin, ligatured, strangled to death, found dead in the woodland, shot by a masked gunman. There's a whole list of them. Boris Berezovsky, Stanislav Makarov, and I'm sure you know them all. Sergei Yushkinov. Now, what are the reason people accept the Skripal narrative that Ross queries is because there does appear to be a pattern of behaviour that fits Putin. Now, we can maybe go through them all one by one, but I don't think that's the point. The point is, if not Putin, who and why were these people targeted? We now find out it may have been fish poisoning or something, which is extraordinary. But how do you explain the long list of dead people?
Well, the list is even longer than the one you cite. One, either British or American publication, listed 181. If Putin had planned the killing of those 181 people, it's hard to see how he would have had time to govern Russia. I mean, it's preposterous.
Sure, but what about the 14 who were repeatedly cited?
All right, but on the list also, I looked over the list, are a number of people who died of heart attacks, it happens, and some who just plain died of old age and cancer. It's gotten preposterous.
Sure, but there are those stabbed and killed outside the Kremlin, etc. About those ones. They're the facts.
Well, I only know of one so-called, well, if you know the Kremlin, Boris Nemtsov was not exactly outside the Kremlin. He was, as they like to say, in view. But the bridge on which he was walking when he was shot is on a highway that runs some distance from the Kremlin. I don't think it proves anything.
No, so you're satisfied?
But here's
nothing
the
to do
point.
with those killings.
Again, I come back to facts. Here's the point. You got to remember what happened. Beginning sometime, it's hard to pinpoint, but let's take Putin's famous speech in Munich, which I know interests you, in 2007. From that point on, Putin has been demonized, certainly in the United States, in a way that Soviet communist Kremlin leaders were never personally demonized. And it was in that context that these allegations that he was personally having enemies assassinated began. And the most famous cases at the beginning, which created the narrative that Putin assassinates people, the most famous cases, as you will recall, was first the famous, well-known Russian oppositionist journalist, Anna Politkovskaya.
Yes.
You remember that case?
Yep, got that here. Yep.
She was the first. Now, I don't want to evoke personal privilege here, but my wife, who's the editor of the American magazine The Nation, and I knew Anya Politkovskaya and have been for years very close to the newspaper for which she worked, Novaya Gazeta, the opposition newspaper, independent newspaper in Moscow. I can tell you as a fact that neither the newspaper nor Politkovskaya's family believe Putin had anything to do with her assassination.
Okay, hit
what
pause.
they do say. Excuse me?
Sorry, Ken, I'm just worried we're going to...
No, go on.
Why don't you finish that thought, and then I'm going to go to the Munich speech. So what do they say?
Well, they don't believe Putin had anything to do with it. They do believe that under his rule, there's a kind of atmosphere of lawlessness in Russia where contract killers who kill for profit or kill for commercial reasons think they can get away with it.
Okay.
But they don't have any reason to believe Putin was behind it, or the Litvinenko case, which is being cited today as a precedent for the Skripal case, the Skripal case. So there is no evidence.
One of the things...
There is supposition, but no evidence.
One of the things that worries me, Professor, is that we actually never get to the argument that Putin is making, because we are forced to spend our whole lives responding to these two-dimensional caricatures of a demonic human being. So I want to go to the Munich speech, regarded as the iconic statement of Russia's hopes, ambitions and challenges. Here is about 35 seconds of Vladimir Putin in 2007 at about the 46th meeting of the Munich Security Conference.
What is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, at the end of the day it refers to one type of situation, namely one centre of authority, one centre of force, one centre of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign, and at the end of the day, this is pernicious not only for those within this system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within. And this certainly has nothing in common with democracy, because, as you know, democracy is the power of the majority, in light of the interests and opinions of the minority.
Stephen, Vladimir Putin reached out to Australia and to Kevin Rudd saying that we have no fundamental contradictions in our relationship, let's collaborate. Australia rejected that invitation. Tell us in your words, what do you believe, this is going to be our last question, we've got about a minute, what is Putin's vision for Russia?
Putin came to power in the year 2000 as the head, now listen to me very carefully because people forget it, the head of a state that had collapsed twice in the 20th century, during the revolution of 1917 and with the end of the Soviet Union. The state collapsed. In Russia, it's called Smuta, S-M-U-T-A. And the collapse of the state is one of the most dread episodes in Russian history because it means the people fall into misery, disease, unemployment, plagues, foreign armies come upon the land. That had happened twice when Putin came to power. His mission, dictated by history, but dictated by himself, and he expressed it often, was to rebuild Russia in a way that was modern and that the state would never collapse again. And to do this through what he called modernizing relationships, economic and political, with the West. For the first 4 or 5 years that he was in power, no serious person denied that he was not an anti-Western Russian leader. And then things changed. And that speech you just played at Munich, I remember it vividly. John McCain and the other arbiters of American security policy were in shock. And do you know why? They hadn't heard a Russian speaker speak like that, to say, no, America cannot run the world alone, since the end of the Soviet Union. Because for more than a decade, they had been used to a Russia on its knees, governed by a very weak leader, Boris Yeltsin, who basically said yes to everything. And remember what Putin said at the end. We want to be your partner, but the era of one-way concessions is over, with an exclamation point. So that, you're right, that was a turning point.
Well, Emeritus Professor Stephen Cohen, this interview is over, but it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for gracing our screens. We appreciate your Hippocratic instinct to avoid harm, and we wish to join you in that endeavour. Stephen Cohen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, and send some sun.
Well, we're going to go to a break right now, but when we come back, Rowan's favourite segment, secretly one of mine, Outsiders Ice Age Weather Report. Don't go away.